Let There Be Light, our Advent series. How many of you have ever celebrated Advent traditionally? Anybody? Okay, some of you have. I had never heard much about Advent. I grew up in the church and had kind of heard that word referenced, but I never really knew what it meant. And the last 2 or 3 years really have been kind of eye-opening for me in terms of this, as I've kind of been able to discover the purpose of Advent, what it's for. Advent is the 4 weeks before Christmas, as Parker referenced before, and it's designed to help us engage with the feeling that the Israelites would have felt as they waited for the Messiah to come. It's a season of waiting. It's a season of anticipation, for longing. Now, this is kind of hard for us because we've all grown up in a world where Jesus has already come, right? And so to kind of put ourselves in a place where we kind of feel and experience what people did before Jesus came is kind of difficult, but that's what we're going to try to do in this series. We're inviting you into the waiting, inviting you into the longing for the Messiah to come and to feel the depth of our brokenness and the effects of it all around us. That shouldn't be that hard. 2016 has been quite the year. It's been a pretty rough year. There's been some external factors that have contributed to that. We've seen rising racial tension in our country and in our world. ISIS continued to try to establish an Islamic caliphate in the Levant, and they have done that through conquest. And so they've massacred entire cities in Syria and Iraq. That's aided in producing the largest humanitarian refugee crisis since World War II. It's actually more people are displaced now than were after World War II. 65 million. 50 million babies were aborted worldwide this year. There have been 2 very significant earthquakes. One was a 7.8 on the scale in Ecuador, killed over 232 people, and a 6.2 in Italy that killed 267. There have been 1,588 terrorist attacks this year. 1,588. That was of last Tuesday, so probably higher because we're averaging 4 a day. 4 a day. And some of these you're familiar with: Libya, Orlando, Istanbul, Brussels, Somalia, and many more, killing 14,517 people to date in terrorist attacks. And there's political unrest and mounting tensions between governments around the globe, and many global powers are experiencing infighting even in their politics, like the United States, Germany, France, Great Britain. So those are some external factors. Others have had internal factors. You've had some suffering. Maybe a doctor gave you a diagnosis, bad news, or you're still dealing with some health issues that won't go away. Maybe it's grief. Maybe you've lost someone you love, or you had to say goodbye to someone who moved away, or you lost the trust of someone important to you. Maybe you've had some family problems. Maybe your husband or wife left you, or your marriage is falling apart, or your kids are going through one of those phases. Maybe you've had financial struggles. You lost your job, or maybe you had your house foreclosed on, or you racked up a lot of debt, or maybe you've had some identity challenges. You're stressed out because the demands that everyone else is putting on you, and you're not exactly sure who you are or who everybody wants you to be. Maybe you haven't been able to find a career that suits you. Whatever it is, it's possible that 2016 was a bad year for you. Some TV commentators and online journalists have even posed the question and wrote articles about it: is 2016 the worst year in history? Like, is this the worst one we've ever had? And the short answer is that that's an imprecise question, because suffering, or worst, is relevant. It's relative. Some have had their best year ever, right? Some people have had their business thriving, they got engaged or married, they've got great, memorable experiences with their family and friends. They wouldn't trade 2016 for anything. It's been wonderful. But others, you've had one of your worst years. And that could be for a multitude of reasons. that other people might look at and say, wow, that's major or that's minor. But it doesn't matter how other people, see it or feel about it, because what matters is how you've experienced it. No one experiences life quite the same way that you experience it. And so we can't minimize or even understand the toll that each different circumstance takes on every different person, right? And so for many people in this room, and for hundreds of millions of people around the world, it has been a very bad year. The world might seem like it's breaking apart, but we're experiencing the same things that the generations before us have. Whether it's the world wars of the 20th century, the civil and revolutionary wars, the Mongol conquest of the 14th century, the Six Crusades of medieval times, or the conquest of the ancient Near Eastern empires, war has been fracturing our world quite some time. Disease and famine, they've been rampant throughout all of history, none more obvious than the bubonic plague of the 14th century, which took over 100 million lives. And the Justinian plague in the 6th century, 25 million. The famines experienced by the Soviets and Chinese in the 20th century, and the Russians, the Scots in the 1600s, and the Mayans in the 800s took millions of lives for one simple reason. They didn't have food and they didn't have water. Many of our parents and grandparents grew up in the Great Depression where things were scarce. Disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, and volcanoes have been taking their toll. The 6th century earthquake in Turkey, the central China floods, or the volcano in 1600 BC that destroyed the entire Minoan civilization. And the evil perpetuated and celebrated in our world by thieves and warlords and human traffickers and murderers continue the long legacy of others of the same mind. And some of you are thinking, this is the worst, most depressing sermon I have ever heard in my life. Consider this. Just 4 chapters after God creates this perfect garden. God looks at humans and sees that they are so evil. Things were so wrong that he, and this is a quote, regretted or was deeply sorry that he had ever made humans. 4 chapters in, brokenness is already there. We can go even further back. Imagine the first humans sitting outside the garden, coming to grips with the truth that their eldest son just murdered their youngest son. First thing, right out of the gate. Since we left the garden, humans have lived in a world that's falling apart at the seams, so to speak. We have all been born into exile, and each generation gets to experience that exile or that brokenness in new and invigorating ways. Israel felt this brokenness very deeply. They were children of the exile. Their ancestors were slaves in Egypt, and God had delivered them with a mighty hand out of Egypt, brought them to this land. He gave them this law. He said, I want you to make a covenant with me. And here it is. I'll be your God if you'll be my people. You guys will be like a city on a hill. You'll be a kingdom of priests. Everyone will look at you and say, that's what it's like when a group of people follow God as their king. But like the first humans, they rejected God's rule. Instead of embracing and broadcasting light, they ran headlong in full speed into darkness. And instead of joining with God in the restoration of all things, they had become all wrapped up in the brokenness before them. They were in the dark, and they felt the night pressing in around them. But in the midst of all this, as Parker talked about before, there's these little promises, these glimpses, these men that heard from God about this day that's coming down the line, a day when all of these things will be made right, a day when a Messiah will come and restore all things. And it's kind of here in this moment that we kind of have to stay. in the dark, in the night, in the season of Advent. This lantern here represents these promises, these little glimpses of light in the dark. They don't illuminate a lot, but they illuminate a little bit. And the light that they give brings some hope, right? That there is something coming down the line that is better. It's here in Advent, as we kind of stay in that moment, where we come to grips with the reality of the pre-New Testament world. It's where we sit with them. It's where we identify with them, waiting, yearning, searching, never finding, looking longingly forward and back for hope, for peace, for joy, and for light. And so over the next 4 weeks, Christmas Eve included, we're going to be looking at these 4 things that are represented by a candle each, these 4 things, and how the incarnation speaks to them. Okay, so that's what we're going to do over the next 4 weeks. Today, though, what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the incarnation. So what is the incarnation exactly? That's a theological word that maybe you understand, maybe you don't. That's what we're going to get in today. So John chapter 1 is where we'll be. John chapter 1. Here's what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, his name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." The Son has made the Father known. If you are listing out the major pieces of theology that every Christian must know and cling tightly to, the incarnation should be at the top of the list. Should be at the very top of the list. The incarnation is the central foundational truth of a theological branch called Christology, which is the branch of theology which asks the question, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? As we've talked about many, many times here, that is the question, isn't it? Who is Jesus? That's the central question of history. It's the central question of our time, and it's the central question of your life. Who is Jesus? The claim of the incarnation says that Jesus is God, come wrapped in human flesh. The doctrine of the incarnation says that God broke through into humanity and became a human. And it's foundational. If Christian theology were a game of Jenga, anybody ever played Jenga? Christian theology were a game of Jenga, the block that you could remove that would cause the whole thing to fall in all at once is the incarnation. If you want the Christian faith to crumble and break all apart, you just pull out the incarnation, and you're left with rubble, left with nothing. It's that important. J.I. Packer, who's a prominent theologian, wrote this: "The real difficulty The supreme mystery with which the gospel confronts us is the Christmas message of incarnation. It's the real mystery. This is the real stumbling block in Christianity. It is here that Jews, Muslims, Unitarians, Jehovah's Witnesses, and many of those who feel the difficulties concerning the virgin birth, the miracles, the atonement, and the resurrection have come to grief. It is from misbelief, or at least an inadequate belief about the incarnation, that difficulties at these other points in the story arise. In other words, the reason that people have trouble believing the miracles of Jesus, and they have trouble believing the virgin birth and the resurrection, all stems from an inadequate belief in the incarnation. That God became a human and lived among us. In his book, Miracles, C.S. Lewis wrote, "The central miracle asserted by Christians is the incarnation." Some Christians have denied this, or at least they've said they were Christians. They've denied this. In the 4th century, there were 3 streams of thought that were kind of going around confronting this idea that Jesus, fully God and fully human. Basically, to summarize them, one said Jesus was just an ordinary human, was born of natural causes, but he was special. He had special gifts, special talents, right? Special blessing put on him by God. That's actually the Arian view, if you know anything about church history, the Arian controversy. There were others who, these people must have been a little strange, because they said that Jesus was a spirit being who appeared to be human, but really wasn't. So, he sat in front of you, he looked like a human, but he actually wasn't a human. He was just a spirit being. Kind of weird. And then there was a third group of people who said he was, in fact, sent by God, to be born as a baby, but he was a created being. He was inferior to God and sent. Now, all of these questions actually resulted in a big conference, which you might have heard of, called the Council of Nicaea. It's where the Nicene Creed comes from. A very foundational thing in church history, happened because this doctrine was being questioned. And it's out of that one of the church fathers, who I will call Athanasius, that's not the proper way to pronounce his name, but the other way is real hard. He penned the church's seminal work on the incarnation, properly titled, are you ready? Very creative. On the incarnation. So it's good. He said, it's a long thing, but he says, the renewal of creation has been fashioned by the Word who made it in the beginning. There is thus no inconsistency between creation and salvation, for the one Father has employed the same agent for both works. What he's saying is that the theology of the incarnation is that Jesus was with God in the beginning. He was God in the beginning. He is the agent of creation. As God is speaking things into existence, it is Jesus who is making things come to life. And so he's the agent that created at the beginning. He's also the agent then that God the Father sends to bring about the reconciliation, the restoration of that created order. That's kind of the doctrine of the incarnation. I know that's kind of deep and profound, but it's important. I mean, this is really important. That's why I kind of wanted to dig down a little bit and get into the meat of this. So the agent of creation at the beginning of time is the same agent of salvation that God sends in the form of a baby. And that brings us back to John chapter 1, where Jesus is called the Word. Now, in English, that just seems kind of weird, right? It's just kind of poetic. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was. What is that? Like, it's kind of strange. Is like Jesus. I mean, we call this the Word of God sometimes, right? It's Jesus, the Bible. I mean, what is that? What is the Word? Well, the Greek word there is logos, and it actually has a very rich Greek philosophy history. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Heraclitus was the first Greek philosopher to write about the Logos. And he did this in like the 6th century BC. And what he described the Logos as was the ordering principle of the universe. Logos is the ordering principle of the world. It's the law of nature. It's the foundation of morality. It is the unifying, underlying source of all reason, of all logic, of all wisdom. See, the basic tenet of Heraclitus' whole belief system is that there's a rational structure to the cosmos. That all of this stuff that's happening around us is not happening by chance. There's actually an order to it. There's a rational structure to it. And he referred to that as the Logos, or something that he would call in his writings, the mind of God. The mind of God. It is, as he would put it, this is really cool, so catch this, an independently existing truth that every person has access to, but in his opinion, very few actually access it, ever. It gives context, according to him, to our human experience, because it allows us to see life through the lens of the real, objective world. Some of you are like, why are we learning about Heraclitus? I didn't come here to learn about Greek philosophy. Well, it's that Greek philosophy that John taps into in John chapter 1 as he's penning this. It's that word that he borrows from Heraclitus, logos, to describe Jesus. What he is saying, what John is saying to anybody that will listen, is that Heraclitus was actually correct in identifying such an agent. He's saying that Jesus is that agent. Jesus is that independently existing truth. Jesus is the ordering principle of the world. Jesus is the one who is the source of all reason and logic and wisdom. Jesus is the rationale structure of the cosmos. Jesus is the mind of God come in human form. Paul emphasizes this in Colossians 1, too. He says, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things on earth were created, whether things visible or invisible, thrones, dominions, powers, rulers, whatever. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things are sustained. Beautiful, isn't it? John describes the Logos that way. He was in the beginning. He was with God in the beginning. He was God in the beginning. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. And what did come into being through him was life. And that life was the light to all people. As Jesus comes on the scene, the light shines in the darkness. The darkness did not overcome it. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. The glimpse that the prophets were giving was coming to light, coming to fruition in Jesus Christ. So do you see this? Do you get this? That Jesus is the agent of creation in the beginning, which means that he is the word that is spoken in the beginning that brought all things into existence. As God saying, as the Father saying, let this, and let this, and let this, and let this. Jesus is the agent of creation that is creating these things. All things were created by him, for him, through him, in him. All things hold together. What were the first words? Let there be light. Let there be light. As far as I can tell, this is very well the most prominent theme in Scripture. God speaking, let there be light. In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was. And then, with the arrival of Jesus, the King, he said, "Let there be light," and there is. And now, through his church, through you and I, he continues to say, "Let there be light," and there will be. The incarnation is not just a historical event. It is an ongoing reality for each new generation to experience. We're not just talking about some dusty old historical event, something that happened that doesn't have any significance for today, blah, blah, blah. We're talking about a historical event that now echoes on and on, that is renewed for each new generation to experience. See, every new generation on this earth experiences hopelessness. But God and Jesus the Messiah says, there is hope. Every new generation on this earth experiences physical, emotional, spiritual, and relational war. But God and Jesus the Messiah says, there is peace. Every new generation on this earth experiences sorrow and pain and injustice. But God and Jesus the Messiah says, there is joy. And every new generation on this earth experiences the darkness closing in on them. But God and Jesus the Messiah says, there is light. There is light. The incarnation is not just a historical event. It is an ongoing reality that you and I get to experience. It echoes on and on into each new generation because it is with the incarnation that God becomes flesh. And that text from Isaiah is fulfilled, where it says, he will be called Emmanuel. And what does Emmanuel mean? God is with us. See, 2016 has been a pretty tough year, a year that emphasizes the state of the broken world. And at times, it might have felt like the world's falling apart. I remember there was a series of like weeks and months where I would like pick up my phone in the morning and go to the news sites, and I was wondering, what is happening? I mean, is it all just like going to end? Will darkness ever lose? Will injustice ever be dealt with? Maybe you felt that as well. Many people come into this season feeling hopeless, feeling at war with themselves or others, full of sorrow, feeling like darkness is winning. But understand this, it is precisely that feeling, it's precisely the hopelessness and the war and the sorrow and the darkness that prepares us to fully grasp the beauty of the incarnation. Gets us ready to receive Jesus the King, cutting through into human history, breaking through the depths of our sorrow and our despair and our anger and our fear and our isolation. Light breaking into the night. So in the midst of the night, we can say, kings of this world have torn it apart, but we can take heart. A baby